Welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology on Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. In the previous videos, we talked about the cardiomyocyte action potential. And this was graphically what it looks like. We have initial depolarization, we've got the plateau and repolarization. And then we looked at what's happening physiologically, what's causing those different things on that action potential graph. And I mentioned that the cardiomyocyte action potential is for one individual cell. It occurs for all cells, whether it's in the atria or ventricle. It may be at different times in the cardiac cycle, but every one of these cells is doing this one time in the cardiac cycle. Okay? But it's for one individual cell. Electrokardiogram is often confused with students because it's also looking at depolarizations and repolarizations, but the EKG, as it's often called, is something entirely different. So this is not the cardiac action potential. I want to make that perfectly clear. Even though we are going to have things like atrial depolarization and ventricular depolarization, this is not the cardiac action potential, because the cardiac action potential is just a measure of the voltage on one membrane of one muscle cell of a cardiomyocyte. One cell. This is more of a microscopic feature. In contrast, when we look at an electrokardiogram, what we're really doing is assessing the strength of the overall electrical activity of the heart. And so what we do is we normally put electrodes on the body. You can put them on various regions, but you're able to detect the overall electrical signals of the heart. And because this is more of a macroscopic approach, instead of seeing the action potential on one individual cell, you're actually seeing the activity of entire chambers of the heart as a whole, not just one cell. But for now, let's go ahead and look at these individual segments or regions of the EKG, the different parts, and hopefully that will make this stuff make a little more sense, and we'll see how this is entire chambers rather than just individual cells. Before I do that, though, I do want to mention that notice here in electrokardiogram, I spelled this with a K. It's just to expose you to this. The guy who invented the electrokardiogram actually won the Nobel Prize for it, but he was Dutch. And I believe that in Dutch and also in German, which was the people who I guess kind of broadcast this, so to speak, cardio is actually spelled with a K. And so it typically has the abbreviation EKG because of the K in cardiogram. In the United States, we like to be unique, I guess, and we use ECG. It's electrokardiogram, but the K instead is a C, so it's ECG. Although normally when you're talking about this, from what I've heard, usually we like to use the abbreviation EKG because you're saying ECG, E and C and G all kind of sound the same. So K, the sound of it kind of gives some contrast. EKG, it's a little bit better to say that. In any case, let's look at the segments here. All right, so this first hump right here, this is what we call the P wave. So the P wave is representative of atrial depolarization. So this is actually the electrical signal, so this actually is atrial depolarization, right? Now, that's the electrical event that the P wave represents. It represents atrial depolarization. But remember, when the atria depolarize, that's going to trigger the atria to contract. And so following atrial depolarization, if we were looking at the heart itself, we would see the atria contract. And remember that contraction we often call systole. So while the electrical event by the P wave is atrial depolarization, the mechanical event that follows it would be atrial systole. Okay? Now, what do we know happens after the atria contract? Well, we know that in a healthy heart, hopefully next the ventricles contract. And that's actually what the QRS complex is. Now, you notice the QRS complex, particularly the R wave up at the top, is much higher than both the P and the T waves. That's because in an EKG, the signal that we get, how high it is proportional to the electrical strength. So that means that this wave, whatever the QRS complex is a lot stronger than atrial depolarization. That is the electrical signal. And in fact, it is. The QRS complex, the electrical event that it is ventricular depolarization. And remember, the ventricles are much bigger, they are much stronger, particularly the left ventricle, and so overall the QRS complex dwarfs the P and T waves, right? So the QRS complex, electrically, it is ventricular depolarization. But we would expect following this to see the mechanical event, ventricular systole, because depolarization causes contraction or systole. Okay? Now, one thing about the QRS complex I want to make clear is that also following atrial depolarization, we should also see the atria relax. We should see atrial repolarization. And to be fair, it is there, but atrial repolarization is hidden by the QRS complex. The QRS complex is so massive that it actually hides atrial repolarization. And so if somebody on an exam asks you about where is atrial repolarization, we don't see it because it's masked by the giant QRS complex. So really the QRS complex is both ventricular depolarization and atrial repolarization, those two electrical events, but we typically associate it with ventricular depolarization and the following mechanical event, ventricular systole. All right, now we have a final wave here called the T wave. The T wave is the final signal in each cycle of the electrocardiogram. The T wave is ventricular repolarization. Okay? So this is when the ventricles are relaxing and ultimately when they're triggered to undergo diastole, or the filling phase. Now, the T wave itself, because this is electrical, this is ventricular repolarization. However, we would expect the mechanical event to follow the T wave would be ventricular diastole, which is when the ventricles are relaxed. Okay? So not only should you know what the various parts of the EKG are, the P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave, but you should also know the electrical event that they are, and also the mechanical event of the heart that follows. Okay? All the depolarization events would have a mechanical event called systole that follows. All the repolarization events would have a diastole event, that is a mechanical event that follows. And so those are the three major things you need to understand. But again, with the EKG, the other thing I want to make perfectly clear, this is not the cardiomyocyte action potential, because the action potential is only looking at one individual cell. This is looking at the heart as a whole. So rather than seeing one cell, we're seeing the entire atria depolarize and then subsequently contract. Here we're seeing the entire ventricles depolarize and subsequently contract, and then here we're seeing the ventricles repolarize and subsequently relax. So hopefully this makes sense. In the next couple of videos, we're going to be looking at some practice problems where we actually determine somebody's heart rate by just simply looking at their electrocardiogram. Some question that you might see come up in lab. But hopefully this video made sense. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you very much.